Chapter 11. The mouth of the labyrinth. Don't be dead weight down there. That was the first thing the labyrinth warden said to me, not to the whole team. To me. He stood at the lip of Valadrift with one boot braced on old stone and a lantern hook in hand, square-shouldered under a weatherproof coat darkened by mineral dust. The drop behind him exhaled cold air that smelled of wet iron, stale earth, and something older than either. Wind moved up from the shaft mouth in slow breaths and tugged at the hem of his coat, making the bronze tags on his belt click softly against one another. His name was Warden Merrick Thorne. He had a face built by years underground, pale where sun failed to reach, lined not by age alone but by looking too long at bad stone and worse decisions. One eye carried an old chip of whiteness at the edge, as if some falling grit had once tried to blind him and only managed to leave a permanent warning. He looked at the others while he spoke, but the line still landed on me. Maybe because my gear was the roughest. Maybe because my skill file had traveled ahead of me. Maybe because he had spent enough years receiving capital assigned help to know exactly how often help arrived in polished boots and died badly where footing mattered more than titles. I heard you, I said. Merrick's mouth did not move. Good. Hearing is cheaper than carrying. The shaft behind him dropped through worked stone into lightless depth. Valadrift was not a natural cave mouth. It had once been an entrance structure, perhaps even a proper monumental descent before time and neglect broke the upper frames and left only the circular throat. Iron winch beams, rope guides, and one surviving platform stair clinging to the inside wall. The current crown had reinforced what it cared to use and left the rest to age into threat. Dorian Pike stood at the edge with a rolled survey sheet under one arm and looked like a man resisting the urge to insult the shaft itself for existing in a classification system that had failed it. He had secured us entry at speed exactly the way he promised he would, through 3 layers of ugly authorization language and 1 letter from a records office too obscure for court vanity to track properly. He had not, however, gotten everything he wanted. What the capital sent with us was not secrecy, but supervision in another coat. Lydia Marrow stood a little apart from the group, gloved hands clasped loosely behind her back, expression unreadable in the morning gray. She had come because Dorian requested a high-caliber magical analyst and because the court, once it heard that phrase, preferred someone visible and valuable attached to the survey. Mila Hart stood beside a crate of rope and pittons, spirit weave resting faint and colorless around 2 fingers like a thought she had not yet chosen to think aloud. Owen Red leaned near the shaft rigging, restless in stillness the way fast men often are. Brent Haver had one hand on a travel shield and looked profoundly offended by the dimensions of the stair descending into the dark. Gareth was not there. The capital had kept him for public duty and controlled demonstrations with sacred sever blade, which he apparently disliked in principle and obeyed in practice. Nina remained under temple assignment. Neither absence made the team lighter. Merrick Thorne looked us over as one might inspect a set of tools delivered by someone else's quartermaster and not all of them appropriate for stone. We used the upper route for first descent, he said. After the second gate split, the old survey branch breaks left toward the panel cluster. If the lower shifts haven't worsened since last winter, you'll have a ledge corridor, 1 narrow bridge, and 2 trapped halls between there and the recorded survey room. If they have worsened, you'll have different trouble. Brent frowned. That's the useful version of your briefing? It's the version that keeps bodies from arguing with rock. Merrick flicked a glance toward the shaft. You'll stay inside my calls until I say otherwise. No large-scale spell discharge without line notice. No sprinting ahead because you dislike walking. No striking wall surfaces that are older than your kingdom unless you want the wall to answer. Owen's expression thinned slightly. That line for me? That line for anyone who mistakes speed for immunity. Lydia asked, what kind of traps? Merrick shifted the lantern hook from one hand to the other. The sort old builders used when they wanted to preserve something after the people it was meant for had already started dying out. Pressure, sequence, false footing, breath vents, weight checks, delayed reset. A few still work. Enough don't that the ones which do become discouraging. Dorian said, and the lower route. Merrick's jaw tightened, unmapped beyond the old survey notation. Cave-in risked. 3 missing on the last full attempt, 1 recovered, 2 not. The wardroom marked it inactive. Convenient, Dorian muttered. Merrick heard and did not rise to it. I care less about convenience than I do about what kills under my watch. That shut the line. I stood near the rope post with my gloves tucked into my belt and let the cold breath from the shaft climb up through my clothes. My left arm had healed enough to stop dictating every movement, but not enough to let me forget it entirely. Tara made sure of that before we left Halcyon at dawn. She had met us in the courtyard with travel wraps, bitter powder, and the exact look she used when convinced the world was collaborating against her standards. You are not fixed, she told me while rebinding the forearm with a pressure that bordered on theology. You are improved. That is not romantic. Do not confuse the two in a hole full of old stone. Then she shoved a small packet into my hand. For headaches. I haven't had one in days. Do not flirt with me through optimism. Alden, still pale but upright enough and Atar angrier but standing, had watched the infirmary steps under a cloak and said only one thing when the wrapping were done. Don't let the walls choose your rhythm. He meant the labyrinth. He might also have meant the capital. With him, one sentence often held more than one working edge. I carried both warnings down to Valadrift. Merrick signaled the first lantern lowered. The descent began. The initial stair clung to the inside shaft wall in long iron-braced segments broken by platforms where old stone met newer support. Water ran in slow threads down one side, catching the lantern light in a way that made depth uncertain and distance insulting. The air grew colder quickly, then steadier, then drier than the upper mouth suggested, as if somewhere below the shaft joined spaces old enough to have made their own weather. No one spoke much on the way down. Metal rang softly under boots. Rope creaked in its guides. The deeper dark beneath the lanterns seemed to wait without urgency, which was somehow worse than if it had felt alive. Brent was the least comfortable on the stair and did the most to hide it. The narrowness denied him the easy certainty of broad-planted footing. Owen looked insultingly unaffected until he had to slow twice behind Merrick at turns too tight for his preferred line. Lydia descended with her eyes on stone joins rather than the drop. Mila touched the wall once every few landings, not to steady herself, I thought, but to let Spirit Weave listen. I descended behind Dorian and watched the shaft construction as we passed. Older stone beneath newer braces, repair stitches across vertical cracks, sections where the original lining was worked with the same branching groove patterns I had seen in the eastern ruin, only here they had been ground down, plastered over, or cut through by later practical repairs. Not erased, used through. That bothered me every time I noticed it. As the second gate split, the shaft gave way to a broad horizontal passage with a rusted portcullis chained up above the floor. Beyond it lay the first of the labyrinth proper. Old corridors, stone sunk partly into living rock, walls too smooth where they were original and too jagged where collapse or later cutting had forced their hand. Merrick raised his lantern and stopped us with one flat palm. From here on, he said, the place stops pretending it wants visitors. The first hall proved him right. It sloped slightly downward and looked simple enough at a glance. 10 yards of old paving, shallow drainage channels, nothing moving, no obvious mechanism. Merrick took one small iron pin from a pouch and dropped it ahead of him. The pin struck stone. Nothing happened. Then, 3 breaths later, the wall to our left exhaled a whisper of pale dust from a line so fine I would never have noticed it unaided. Delayed breath slit, he said. Gas once, probably. Mostly dust now. Maybe not always. He moved along the outer edge with care so practiced it no longer resembled caution at all. Just grammar. Stop. Watch the floor lines. Watch the seams. Watch the ceiling once every 3 steps so the place doesn't kill you vertically while your pride is busy below. We followed in order. Owen lasted perhaps 12 yards before saying quietly, "This is absurd." Merrick did not turn. "No, this is old." That set the tone for the next hour. Valadrift refused broad confidence. Every strength the capital liked because it looked clean in a demonstration became awkward the deeper the corridor logic narrowed. Lydia could have burned through half a siege line in open terrain, but here even her probing sparks made the wall veins hum wrong where ancient channels still held dormant structure. Brent's defensive weight was valuable in a breach and cumbersome on ledges built for lean feet and exact balance. Owen's speed became something to keep leashed because old pressure plates do not respect talent. They only notice force and sequence. Mila's perception helped constantly, but the deeper threads of the place tangled with old residue until Spirit Weave gave warning more often than clear instruction. In me, I had entered with controlled distance. Not low confidence. Not high. Just a hard deliberate refusal to promise usefulness before the labyrinth demanded proof. The proof came sooner than I expected. The narrow bridge Merrick mentioned was less a bridge than a surviving spine across a vertical crack where the original passage had partially torn away. 2 shoulder widths of ancient stone remained, bordered on one side by iron rail supports long rusted through and on the other by open black drops swallowing the lantern through a hole. Water had slicked the center line to a treacherous sheen. Halfway across, the stone pitched a degree left where the supporting wall had settled. Merrick crossed first with insulting efficiency. "Single file," he called, "back. No heroics. If you slip, you go with your mouth shut so the rest of us can hear the second problem." Brent muttered something that sounded like an insult directed at all dead architects. Lydia went next, precise and almost expressionless. Mila after her, light-footed but visibly tense. Then me. The bridge wanted concentration in ugly ways. Not simply don't fall, more like don't waste the wrong inch of balance because the old tilt on the left side invited the body to overcorrect, and overcorrection on wet stone is just another form of falling. I let the breath settle into the motion as soon as the first boot touched the slick center line. Step and regulate. Weight low. Ribs quiet. The slight smoothing from the side came almost immediately, faint and useful. Not enough to make the bridge safe, enough to keep my chest from climbing into alarm and stealing attention from my feet. 3 steps. 5. At the pitch line, the sole of my right boot skated an inch. My body answered before the thought fully formed. Hips corrected. Foot caught. The tiny extra adjustment I had found in the old chamber under collar brushed through the motion and turned what could have become panic into only embarrassment. Behind me, Brent swore. You almost went. Almost isn't gone, I said. That was more confidence than I would have offered 3 weeks earlier. I noticed the change and said nothing about it. Owen crossed after me and hated every second he had to move at human speed. Brent followed last, each of his steps making the ancient spine complain in little chalky noises that kept everyone else listening harder than they liked. We made the far side without falling. No one praised the result because not falling is too low a bar for speech in places built to make falling common. The second hall was where the labyrinth started teaching harder. It opened into a low rectangular chamber lined with half-collapsed niches and crossing floor bands cut into the paving in alternating pale and dark stone. 3 doorways led out. The central one, according to Merrick, was the old survey route. The problem was the floor. Mila's spirit weaves spread in faint colorless filaments over the bands and immediately came back troubled. There's too much old response here, she said. That one mechanism. Layered triggers. Dorian's eyes sharpened at that word. Layered how? She shook her head once, frustrated. Not in a clean grid. Some are weight. Some maybe timing. The old lines are talking over each other. Merrick crouched and laid his lantern on the floor so the light skimmed the bands at an angle. There, in the shallow dust and mineral bloom, I saw it. Hair-thin scoring across certain pale stones. Not wear, but repeat contact. The dark bands held less. Sequence path, I said before I quite meant to. Merrick glanced up. Maybe. I pointed. These pale stones were used more, but not all of them. See the third line? It's cleaner near the edge, then worn center, then edge again. Dorian moved in beside me at once. Lydia too, because nothing draws mages faster than pattern if the pattern might matter. Merrick considered the floor another moment. Test it, then. Not me alone. The idea! I took one chalk stub from my pocket and stepped to the threshold. Not onto the chamber yet, only near enough to reach, touch, and also leave. I laid a faint thread mark on the first pale band at the left edge, then another on the central worn strip, then another near the right edge of the next band in sequence. The marks took weakly, but enough that the line of them held in my awareness as distinct points. I stood back. The path bends, I said. Not straight through. Left, center, right. Owen frowned. From what? Different phase triggers, Dorian said before I could. He knelt and watched Mila's threads drift over the floor. Wait here. Delay there. Reset there. A simple straight advance would activate the wrong chain. Merrick looked at me once with new, narrower attention. Walk it. Brent laughed softly in disbelief. That's your first instinct. It's the one that learns fastest, Merrick said. I did not enjoy being volunteered. I walked the line anyway. Left edge on the first pale band. Center on the next. Right edge on the third. Pause 1 breath. Cross the dark line without full commitment. Step again. The chamber held. No needles. No floor drop. No gas slit opening in the wall. Behind me, Lydia said, continue. I hated that she was already talking like a commander in a place where one mistake would make my bones anonymous. I continued. The sequence twisted once more near the central threshold. My marks from the first 2 stones had already begun to fade, but the pattern had settled in the body enough that I caught the logic. Not a line for one person only. A line teaching distributed weight and delayed timing. Not exactly instruction. Not merely security either. Movement with attached conditions. When I reached the central doorway intact, the earned confidence began. Small, hard, not emotional. The sort that grows from doing the work while others watch, and the stone does not kill you for the answer. I turn. 2 at a time is wrong, I said. 1 only. Same sequence. Owen crossed second. Without my thread marks on the first stones, he would probably have reached the far side by reasoning and irritation alone. With them, he made it cleanly and looked annoyed by how much slower clarity felt than speed. Mila came next and breathed easier once my marks let her separate the useful floor pattern from the old residual noise. Lydia moved precisely through the line and said, when she reached the doorway, it rewards composure. No, Brent muttered from the far threshold. It punishes haste. That as well. He crossed last, badly once when his heel nearly clipped a dark band too fully and only did not trigger whatever answer slept in the chamber because he trusted my shouted shorten his step. Quickly enough to obey before pride recovered. On the far side he exhaled hard. That was ridiculous. Merrick hooked the lantern and moved on. That was architecture. The worst stretch began after that because the labyrinth had taken our measure and decided to complicate the lesson. The ledge corridor beyond the chamber ran along a natural fault where one wall remained worked and the other had broken away into a long drop scattered with old fallen blocks. In some sections the floor held 3 men abreast, in others only 1.5 if the half did not value their ankles. Thin stone ribs crossed overhead like the remains of a collapsed ceiling lattice. Water dripped from somewhere deeper and made the outer lip dark. Merrick halted us at the first serious break. The ledge ahead had subsided around a collapsed pillar, leaving only a narrow run of surviving flagstone on the inner side and a cracked, unsupported shelf on the outer. Past that, the route doglegged sharply under a low-hanging slab where the ceiling had settled enough that Brent would need to turn one shoulder to get through. "Wonderful," he said. Merrick ignored him. "Weight check first." He tested the inner stones with the iron pin. "Sound enough." The outer shelf answered with a hollow note that made the skin around my neck tighten before thought caught up. Lydia extended one hand and let the smallest possible thread of astral fire drift toward the crack line. The wall answered immediately with a shivering red pulse through dormant channels. She cut the magic at once. "That would be bad," she said. Dorian, absurdly calm, replied, "Excellent observation. Keep the ceiling." Owen peered past Merrick at the dogleg and the low slab. "One by one again." "Yes," Merrick said, "and if something comes from the far side, then your speed will finally be forced to serve your patience." The ledge might still have been manageable as a slow crossing if the old place had left it there. It didn't. Halfway through Lydia's passage beneath the low slab, the stone above gave a dry cracking report and dropped a fist-sized fragment onto the inner line 2 paces behind her. Not a collapse yet. A warning. Everyone stopped. The fragment bounced once and skidded toward the outer hollow shelf. The shelf answered with a deeper crack. I saw the problem in ugly sequence all at once. Lydia could not retreat fast without overloading the weakened run behind her. She could not cast force wide without exciting the wall channels again. If Brent went in after her, the load would worsen the crack. If Owen tried to dart through, his acceleration might do the same. Mila's threads spread, searching, and came back thin with strain. The outer shelf is almost gone. The inner line holds, but only if the turn under the slab is light. Light, Brent said, offended by the existence of the word. Merrick was already recalculating with his eyes. Strip packs, reduce load, wheeze, vast, ropes, pittons, spare satchels, one by one passed back and stacked where the last solid stones widened enough to take them. Lydia remained frozen under the slab because one wrong shift now would decide everything. I stepped to the edge of the safe line. "I can mark the turn." Merrick looked at me. "Do it." I laid 2 quick thread marks, one on the last safe inner stone before the crack widened, one on the place under the slab where the weight needed to settle and turn instead of pushing outward. The marks took. Enough. "Lydia," I said. "Follow the marks, not the crack." She did not waste time asking what I meant by feel. She trusted the line because the chamber behind had proven I was at least worth borrowing from. Left foot, settle, turn shoulder, shorter step. The slab above scraped dust into her hair as she passed beneath it, but the inner stones held. She emerged on the far side, one problem down. Then the outer shelf broke anyway. Not under her. Under the dropped fragments delayed slide. The crack ran outward in a fast dry tearing line, and half the shelf gave way into the dark with a noise like plates stacked wrong. The break did not hit the inner path directly, but the shock traveled through the dogleg and jolted the settled slab above it. That slab moved. Only an inch. Enough. Lydia was clear. The next person would not have the same space. If we took too long, the whole turn might worsen beyond passage. If we rush, we might finish the break for it. Owen swore softly. Merrick exhaled once. Cross, then heart. Red after if line holds. That surprised me enough that I nearly looked behind myself for some other cross. "Why me?" "Because you're the one who's been leaving a road inside the ground all morning." That was not praise either. It still tightened something cleanly in the chest. I went. The ledge wanted fear badly there. The broken outer lip drew the eye. The low slab bent the body into an angle that made balance feel dishonest. Dust trickled from the shift line overhead in tiny constant streams that said time had turned expensive. I kept the breath low and moved on the marks I had left, building one real act after another. Step and steady. Turn and regulate. Touch the inner wall, and also leave the next point for Mila. When I reached the dogleg, I felt the slab's weight in the air over my back, and the old chamber lesson from Calder came into me unasked. Choose the useful loss. I gave up the cleaner, upright posture and folded lower than pride preferred. Less headroom spent. Better line through. The turn held. I crossed. Mila followed my marks with visible relief, light enough on the stones that a worst of the shifted load ignored her. Then Owen. He hated moving carefully. I could feel it from the way his shoulders carried the restraint-like insult. But he obeyed the line and came through clean, though not happily. Brent was the real question. There was no replacing his weight with technique. Not entirely. Merrick considered, then said, shield off. Armor loosened. Turn side on before the dogleg and don't fight the crouch. Brent glared. If this cracks under me, it will, Merrick said. The question is whether you are moving when it does. Brent made a sound halfway between disgust and acceptance. He entered the turn. The stone answered him immediately. Not failure. Complaint. Thus, tiny grit falls. A low groan from somewhere under the inner line. He began to hunch under the slab. Too late. Too much. The top of his shoulder scraped stone hard enough to shift the settled slab a second time. I saw the movement and the inevitable next fraction. He did not. Merrick did. Down. He barked. Brent obeyed by instinct, and because he did, the slab clipped only the upper rim of his loosened backplate instead of taking him at the neck. The impact drove him outward toward the broken shelf. There was no room and no time for a big save. No one in that corridor possessed one. I lunged to the edge from the safe side and slammed the flat of my sword against the inner wall just ahead of his slipping path, aiming not at him, but at the angle. Strike, and also shove. The weak push at the end of the blow ran along the line I needed, just enough that when Brent's weight hit the wall he rebounded inward instead of outward. At the same instant Owen, faster than complaint, caught Brent's bracer and Mila threw one light spirit weave line across his back to keep the turn from widening into a fall. 3 ugly answers overlapping. Enough. Brent hit the safe side hard on one knee and swore so sincerely the ledge deserved it. Merrick waited until the last dust drift fell. Then he said, that is what I meant. No one had breath left to ask which part. The ledge set piece took the distance out of the group after that. Not friendship. Something more immediate. Dependency admitted under pressure. Mila asked for my marks before uncertain corners now instead of pretending spirit weave alone could resolve every old residue tangle. Owen watched my footing choices when the floor changed. Brent, irritated by his own survival, stopped making comments every time the route demanded something subtle and instead saved his breath for where weight mattered. Lydia said little, but whenever the walls showed old channel structure she began checking with me before testing magic broadly. That was the earned confidence deepening, not in speech, in other people's adjustments. The next trap hall made it clearer. It was narrower than the first and lined with low wall niches holding ancient bronze heads shaped like beasts I did not recognize. Their mouths were open. The floor between them looked plain until Merrick pointed out the pressure stones hidden under mineral bloom. Needles or gas? Owen asked. Maybe both, Merrick said. Dorian crouched by one bronze mouth and frowned. These were modified. Original channels widened later. He touched a seam with the back of his glove. Cruder work. Newer. Abyssal interference? Lydia asked. Or previous scavengers making old danger less discriminating. That fit the place too well. Mila spread spirit weave and winced. The triggers aren't even now. The left side answers quicker. I looked at the floor, the mouths, the mineral pattern, and felt the same thin edge of possible observation I had first sensed on the fog road to Calder. Not a separate power, only a little more attention freed because movement and breath cost less when managed properly. I walked the first 2 safe stones slowly without committing deeper. Look, and also measure. The old heads aligned not to the pressure stones directly, but to the spaces after them. Delayed strike pattern. 1 beat late, I said. Merrick glanced at me. Say it again. The mouths answer the step after the plate, not the plate itself. He tested with the iron pin and proved it. Plate pause, hiss from the wall mouth beyond. Owen exhaled sharply. That's filthy. Yes, Merrick said. Now walk it anyway. Whiz it. Pressure, pause, move before the delayed line caught where the body wanted to be. There were too many safe positions for thread marks on everyone, so I used them only at the changes where the pattern shifted speed. Mila's threads confirmed the delays. Leah watched the wall channels for magical flare. Brent carried the rear weight where a needled leg would be least survivable. Owen, absurdly, found some bitter pleasure in keeping perfect, ugly timing once the challenge was named honestly. Dorian wrote while walking, the madman. At one point he said, as if to himself more than the rest of us, the place thinks in sequences, not declarations. No one answered, but I carried the sentence forward. By the time we reached the old survey room, the practical hierarchy of the expedition had rearranged itself without anyone admitting it aloud. Not by rank, by problem. Where the route widened and danger turned obvious, Merrick led with experience and Brent anchored the group with sheer bodily certainty. Where the floor became language in old stone, Dorian and Lydia interpreted. Where the walls needed listening, Mila did it better than any of us. Where speed could matter without becoming stupidity, Owen's body was at blade. And where the place hid its answers in small transitions, step length, turn angle, delayed triggers, uncertain footing, route memory, slight corrections, that work kept landing in my hands. I was not carrying the expedition. I was no longer being carried by it either. The old survey room had once been a controlled study chamber, maybe even a camp point for earlier teams. Square cut, low ceiling, half-collapsed shelves in the walls, soot traces from long-dead braziers, and on the far side 3 carved panels partly protected from weather by the chamber's overhang. The middle panel was shattered. The outer 2 survived enough to make Dorian suck in breath through his nose like a man trying not to frighten his own thoughts. One showed a figure stepping into a guarded angle with 3 branch lines descending from the forearm and 2 from the lead foot. The other depicted a blade contact where the defender's line did not stop at opposition but carried around the bind and into what looked like the attacker's rear balance. Attached meanings again. Not ceremony, not theater. Instructions waiting for a body. Dorian went to work immediately. Rubbings, notes. Lydia watched the panel geometry like a mage staring at a spell from a dead language and trying not to envy it. Mila listened to the walls and found 2 hollow spots under the floor, but no immediate access. Marek checked the remaining route options deeper and came back with bad news in his face. The recorded return path collapsed past the second turn, he said. If Pike wants the lower panel cluster, we use the inactive descent. Dorian did not even look away from the rubbing. Yes, Marek's jaw tightened. That route is not wardroom cleared. Good thing we are not the wardroom. That is not the comfort you think it is. Dorian finally looked up. No, he said. It is the necessity I think it is. So we went lower. The inactive descent began behind the survey room under a split lintel and a slope of broken blocks where older worked steps disappeared beneath collapse. The air changed there. Colder, drier, less touched by recent use. Our lantern light seemed to travel shorter distances, as if the dark had become less interested in surrendering its shapes for free. Marek tied a safety line for the first drop. Brent had to remove his travel pack entirely to fit the gap. Owen stopped complaining because complaint in a place like that only echoes your own nerves back at you. I laid thread marks more carefully now, not because I feared losing the route though I did, but because the stone itself felt more responsive the deeper we went. Not active, not alive, just more willing to hold contact, the way the outer ruined stones had before the central platform. Dorian noticed after the third mark. Stronger. Yes, on carved surfaces only? Mostly. He wrote that down without further comment, which meant it mattered. The lower route wound through a broken sequence of chambers and fault corridors where the original architecture had been forced to negotiate with the mountain more bluntly. In one room, the floor had sunk around a central shaft and left only an angled ring passable near the wall. In another, 3 support pillars had fused with natural stone growth until the old carvings on them looked trapped inside a cave trying to digest a temple. Everywhere, the same branching grammar returned in fragments, circles cut into thresholds, motion lines on support faces, repeated emphasis at joints and transitions rather than poses or symbols of devotion. We passed one slab on which a figure appeared to be landing from a drop with branched lines flaring not upward but through the knees, hips, and the next foot placement. I stared long enough that Lydia said quietly, "You're seeing technique." "Yes, not memory." "No." She nodded once, as if that answer satisfied something she had been testing. The final descent opened on a long cracked ramp running into what Marek called the lower route and what the older survey notes, according to Dorian, had described only as peripheral access beneath panel zone, unstable. The wording had not exaggerated enough. The ramp floor bore old fracture lines filled with pale mineral deposits. The walls tightened and widened unpredictably, and the ceiling in places was not ceiling so much as old slabs jammed between natural rock, trusting gravity by habit rather than conviction. Far below, beyond the reach of the lanterns, something metallic struck once and then stopped. Not a current mechanism, a settling echo maybe, or not. Marek held up his hand and we all paused. "From here on, if the floor goes, it won't ask twice," he said. "That's encouraging," Brent muttered. "It's on us." We began the last approach. This was where Flashy's strength turned clumsy in full view. The ramp required constant adjustments. One section had to be taken on the inner line because the outer stones had debonded from the bedrock beneath. Another forced a low crouch where Lydia's usual casting posture would have cracked her head open. Twice Brent had to unshoulder sideways through pinched turns and hated the helplessness of narrowing his body to fit a world that did not care how strong he looked in wider halls. Owen's speed was almost entirely useless now because each transition demanded exact negotiation with stone memory and old weight. My own work became relentless and small. Touch the inner pillar, and also leave the route. Step and regulate. Watch the crack line, and also count the spacing to the next stable hold. Block a falling chip from Mila's head, and also turn the angle so it skitters outward rather than into the group. Nothing dramatic, constant enough to matter. At one point the ramp narrowed around a broken torsion pillar where a section of old bronze mechanism jutted through the floor like a rib. Marek tested the passage and shook his head. Sequence plate under the left line. Still low. Mila's threads confirmed it faintly. Lydia said, "Can we deaden it?" Dorian, reading the wall carving beside it, replied, "If you do it broadly, you may also wake the reset." No one liked that. I crouched and studied the floor. The plate was hidden, the mechanism old, the space too tight for a full jump and too narrow for Brent to do anything but commit. Then I saw the worn edge on the bronze rib, the slight polish where earlier passage had used it not as obstacle but as support. Not left line, I said. Center, then rib, then right. Merrick glanced down. You trust that? No, but what it? The center stone first. Weight short. Hand on bronze rib. Use it not to pull but to steal load from the hidden plate. Step out to the right where the floor looked worse, but sounded better under the boot because the crack line there was surface only. The mechanism did not answer. The others followed. Brent had trouble fitting the shift exactly, and when his weight threatened to drop too hard on the plate I caught his bracer and shoved him half a step farther than his own balance wanted. A tiny ugly assist. He made the right side stone and glared at me as if uncertain whether to be insulted or grateful. I preferred that to hearing him hit the trap. By then even Eric had stopped treating me as capital extra and started asking short practical questions before certain transitions. Mark this fork. Which stone holds best? Can your thread stay on that lintel? The answer to the last was yes, but only barely. The mark on carved stone above the fork held stronger than bark or plain slab, and when I turned away I could still feel the route point in the back of the mind like a cold pin. Dorian looked at me when I admitted that. Precision's improving. It's not precise. No, he said. It's becoming less crude. That was close enough to approval that I carried it carefully. Whatever had been changing in me settled when we entered the final lower hall before the lowest chamber. Control distance had taken me into the labyrinth. Tightening focus had carried me through its first lessons. What arrived now was not certainty, but earned confidence sharpened by repetition and need. My body no longer waited for every old floor to name itself before deciding it had a right to act. The small answers came more readily, not bigger, fleeter. Step and breathe, touch and mark, guard and slip, move and watch. A place like Valadrift made obvious power awkward, but it made ugly practical combinations accumulate. That was enough. The final hall opened under a high broken arch into a chamber larger than anything below the survey room had prepared me for. The floor descended in 3 wide cracked terraces toward a central platform half sunk into the mountain. Pillars ringed the space, many broken, some still upright, each carved with the same branching grammar I had seen in the eastern ruin and Calder's deeper stones. The ceiling vanished into a vault of shadow webbed with ruthin mineral veins and old support braces. The air was colder there, not natural cave cold, stillness cold, the sort that feels preserved rather than merely absent of warmth. Merrick lifted his lantern higher and cursed under his breath. Dorian did not speak at all for the first full breath, because at the far end of the chamber, beyond the last terrace and before a wall of shattered panels, something stood in a recess built exactly to hold it. At first glance I thought statue, ancient guardian figure in old segmented armor, taller than Brent by a head, broad through the shoulders, one arm ending in a long bladed extension rather than a hand, the other fitted with a layered shield or locking mechanism grown into the forearm. The helm was faceless except for a vertical slit down the center. Branching lines ran through the armor plates, not ornamental, but engineered, feeding from chest to limb in a complexity that made current military design look blunt. Then the lantern light shifted. Black growth crawled through those old branch channels. Not rust, not ordinary decay. Abyssal corruption had entered the ancient body like ink forced into veins, filling the old meaning lines with something colder and more absolute. Mila's spirit weave went thin and strained around her fingers. Lydia's gaze narrowed until it looked painful. Owen said nothing at all. Dorian took one involuntary step forward and stopped himself by force. Gods preserve us, Merrick murmured. The Guardian's faceless helm tilted. Just a fraction. Then the black in the central slit ignited with a thin interior light, and somewhere inside the old chamber, under the stone and roots and all the buried systems we had spent the day parsing in fragments, a mechanism older than a kingdom woke and recognized us as late. Chapter 12. What follows the blow? The Guardian was nearly untouchable to direct specialists. It moved before any of us had the comfort of calling it a statue no longer. One moment the faceless helm had only tilted in its recess. The next, the black corruption in its central slit flared once like a thin wound opening to light, and the entire armored body came off the stone shelf in a single descending line that made the terraces look too small for it. Owen, no. Merrick started. Too late. Lightning stride cracked blue-white across the chamber and Owen Red vanished from where he stood. For a heartbeat, I thought speed itself might solve the problem. The chamber was large enough to permit it. The Guardian had only just woken. A direct specialist answer against an unready target. It was exactly the kind of exchange the Capital liked to imagine when naming people's worth. Then the Guardian turned one shoulder. That was all. Not a dramatic block. Not a heroic wind-up. It shifted its armored mass by the minimum required, and the bladed forelimbs swept across the air where Owen should not yet have been. Yet it was there first, not because it was faster, but because it had already read the only line a speed first attack could take on that footing and met the result instead of the movement. Owen reappeared in a shower of sparks 3 paces farther right than intended, forced out of his line with one sleeve cut open from elbow to wrist. Not deep. Too close. That, Merrick barked. The Guardian landed on the first terrace without noise proportionate to its weight. That frightened me more than the speed had. It should have struck stone like a dropped gate. Instead, the impact is absorbed through the old branching channels toward its armor and the terror is beneath, as though room itself been built to catch our buddy continuous motion rib and punish it for being heavy. Lydia's answer came immediately. Star-crowned sorcery unfolded above her hand in tight controlled geometry, no battlefield extravagance, just a compressed astral flare aimed for the seam between helm and upper torso where any honest machine, old or new, should have hated heat. The fire hit. The chamber flashed red gold. For one delicious instant, I thought she had it. Then the flare sheared, not dispersed, not resisted cleanly. The light struck the branching grooves in the Guardian's chest and peeled away along 3 subsidiary paths through the armor and down into the floor, bleeding force into old channels hidden under the terrace line. The primary impact still scorched black over the sternum plate, but the result was wrong split, redirected, thinned of its proper violence. The Guardian kept coming. Not straight. Dorian shouted. That was useful exactly 1 second too late as well. Brent Haver planted himself on the second terrace with iron bastion rising bronze over his frame, shield high, body turning into the kind of obvious wall the rest of us had been taught to trust. Against ordinary pressure, even extraordinary pressure, that might have held. The Guardian did not try to break the wall by force. It struck the shield line low, not hard, but perfectly placed, then rotated its locked forearm into Brent's stance before the rebound had fully finished. The first contact tested. The second ruined the posture beneath the defense. Brent held his ground for half a heartbeat on sheer stubborn density, then lost the line through the left hip and staggered half a step wider than he wanted. That was enough. The Guardian's next movement was already inside the space the posture break created. It would have taken Brent at the throat if Mila's spirit weave had not snapped across the gap like pale glass and bent the angle by inches. Even so, the bladed arm carved a long bright line across his shoulder plate and sent him crashing against a broken pillar hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Not one action. Never one. Every exchange it made contained the next answer inside the first. Pressure climbed through my body so quickly it almost felt cool. Not panic yet. Recognition with teeth. The old carvings. The branch lines at the joints. The attached meanings. The motion schema Dorian named in the ruin. One movement doing more than one job. The Guardian was not just ancient. It was built, or trained, or preserved through a system that treated actions the same way aside was beginning to reveal itself to me except where mine was ugly and partial. This thing embodied the principle in steel and black corruption. Merrick dropped to the lower left flank and shouted, "Do not feed it straight lines." Easy to say, harder to obey, while a towering ancient construct descended the terraces with a bladed limb built for corridor executions and a shield arm that made direct center entries look suicidal. I moved right with Mila and Dorian because the scholar had no business where the Guardian's first descent naturally wanted bodies. Owen had already shifted wide, fast enough to blur, but no longer willing to commit on faith alone. Lydia restructured her casting stance to stop pouring clean force into channels that wanted to split it. Brent pushed himself up from the pillar, furious and slower on the injured side. The Guardian paused on the second terrace for one impossible calm beat. Then it changed targets and came for Dorian. Not because the scholar was weak. Because it's all of looked at double but then over is over his I cut across Dorian's path before I had time to think how insulting that line of movement was to survival. Shield up, not to win, to intercept. The Guardian's bladed arm came down in a short descending cut that should have shattered my guard or driven me to one knee even if the arm held. I took the impact on the outer quarter and let the force slide instead of meeting it square, the motion ugly, but practiced now in my bones. Slip the line. Save the body. The blow screamed across the shield rim and tore a spark line into the stone at my boot instead of driving straight through. At the same time I shoved Dorian behind my left shoulder with the back of my sword arm. Defend, and also move the target. The second half of that came from training and fear in equal measure. The first came from aside. The little secondary adjustment running along the block spoiled the ideal strike line by just enough that the displacement mattered. Dorian stumbled clear. The Guardian's shield arm turned for me next. No pause, no waste. The block and target denial were already feeding the follow-up. I did not try to be brave. I retreated half a step, then found the extra stolen measure behind the retreat that had first flickered into existence on bad stone beneath Fort Calder. Not a full lunge, not speed, just a second, thin half-step attached to a committed movement after the body had already spent the first. The distance changed. The shield arm passed where my ribs had been. I felt the wind of it on my coat and nothing else. Merrick saw. No time to answer. Owen flashed in from the Guardian's unshielded side, using my slip not as opening but as proof of one. His blade kissed the back of the Guardian's knee joint with all the speed in him, and then he was gone before the return line could erase him. A shallow hit, worthless to ordinary expectation, valuable because for the first time the Guardian had not fully chosen its own next step. Lydia understood immediately. She sent not a broad flare this time, but 3 tight astral needles aimed not where the armor was thickest, but where Owen's cut and the old branch grooves intersected. 2 sheared away into dead lines. The third burned a narrow bright track into corrupted plating just above the joint and made the Guardian's descent stutter. Brent roared and came in on the shield's side, not to trade blows, but to hit the construct's torso with the full hateful certainty of a man denied elegance and therefore committed to mass. The impact landed. The Guardian gave ground by half a pace. That was all the progress in the world, and it was enough to keep us alive for another exchange. Pressure became work after that. Not clean team coordination, not capital formations. Something rougher and more honest. Merrick reading the chamber, shouting which terrace edges were hollow and which pillar shadows gave the Guardian too easy a lateral line. Lydia cutting her magic down to hard precise intrusions whenever an old channel exposed itself. Owen forcing the construct to acknowledge side entries it would rather ignore. Brent giving it weight problems when no one else could. Mila laying spirit weave across blind corners and platform cracks so we stopped dying to the room while trying to survive the Guardian. And me, increasingly, at the ugly seams between those things. The Guardian hated direct, singular intent because direct singular intent was exactly what it had been shaped to answer. The moment an attack declared itself too clearly, it was already being turned, spoiled, or used. So, I stopped trying to matter in primary lines. I cut where balance fed. I blocked where lanes needed opening. I moved where one ally's completion became another ally's beginning. Not because I was noble enough to give up the kill. Because my own kill line was not worth enough yet to insist upon. The central terrace became the fight's throat. The Guardian refused to leave the lower half of the chamber, not fully. Every time Owen or Brent tried to pull it wide, it corrected toward the central platform where broken panel stones and old channel grooves converged. That was the real shape of its purpose. Not kill intruders for satisfaction. Hold the lower space. Protect the old core. Dorian saw it first in words. It isn't defending itself. He shouted from behind a pillar where he had no business, still taking notes between near death and dust. It's defending the platform. Merrick snarled back. That's not easier. No, Dorian said. But it's useful. That was true. Useful truths rarely arrive kindly. The next exchange nearly killed Owen. He tested a high feint into the Guardian's shield side, intending to trigger the first answer and then break low. The Guardian did answer, but not at the level Owen expected. It took the feint into the shield, let the impact right its own angle, and sent the stored line into a downward secondary cut through the space Owen's real movement had to occupy next. I saw it because by then I had stopped watching its current action alone. Every line it made held a second edge if the eye stayed with it. Owen, drop! He heard the first word and obeyed before the second completed, which probably saved him. The secondary cut took a strip of hair and lantern light over his head instead of opening the skull. At the same moment I moved in from the Guardian's offside and slammed my shield into the lower shield arm joint. Not to damage, to change the angle before the next answer formed. The impact hurt. Barely moved it. The weak extra shove at the end of the committed bash added enough to spoil the smooth return path. Owen rolled clear. Mila's threads flashed across the disrupted line. Leia put one narrow fire cut into the open elbow seam. Not much. Enough. That was the pattern beginning to turn beneath the pressure. I was no longer only adding scraps to isolated acts. The scraps were starting to bridge. One action setting the terms of the next. A block creating a lane. A bash creating a misalignment. A movement preserving an ally's timing. A touch carrying forward into a later read. Not mastery. Not style. Sequence. The Guardian knew sequence better than I did. That only made the lesson harsher. It drove Brent back down a terrace with a two-phase shield break, at first forced his guard wide, then hit the emptied space with the bladed arm a fraction later than human timing preferred. It clipped Marish thigh through leather because he chose the wrong side of a collapsing pillar to pivot around and had to slash his own cloak away to keep the wound from binding. It nearly crushed Lydia against a wall groove after she cut one of its branch channels too deeply, and the old chamber answered her with a feedback pulse through the stone. Each time, direct excellence met the thing and learned why the chamber had kept it. Pressure to focus. Focus to adaptation. That was the emotional movement of the fight and the only reason we did not die in the first minute. I touched a cracked pillar while retreating from one exchange and left a quick thread mark without planning it. Then another on the edge of the second terrace where a stable footing line crossed a broken channel. Then, when the Guardian drove Brent backward again and turned to finish him, I realized those marks were not only route memory, they could become timing anchors. I moved on the marked terrace edge, felt the thread in the back of the mind, and knew exactly how far my rear foot could commit without meeting dead stone under the dust. That let me enter harder than I would have risked blind. I cut at the Guardian's lower side seam, not deep, deliberate, and at the instant of contact I narrowed the aside expression the way I had on bark and hidden stakes. Touch, and also leave. The mark took, much stronger than on flesh would have been. The Guardian's corrupted branch channels seized it like old carved stone had seized earlier threads. I nearly lost the next breath from surprise. There it was, a thread fixed not to the room, but to the moving enemy. The Guardian turned, the thread dragged across my awareness. Not visual, not prophecy. A faint, terrible sense of where the marked line on its body was moving through space and tension. Dangerous. Useful. I understood both, too late to remain comfortable and just early enough to use it. It came for me again. This time, when the shield arm rolled to bind and the blade line hid behind the motion, I felt the marked side of its torso coil a fraction before the secondary cut emerged. So I did not block where the current line wanted. I slipped the first contact off my shield and took the extra half step after it, the stolen measure that changed distance by just enough, and the secondary cut passed through where my knee had been. I was inside. For the first time in the fight, properly inside. The marked seam on its side pulsed in my awareness. I drove the short sword into that line, not to penetrate the full plate it wouldn't, but to strike exactly where Owen's earlier cut in Lydia's needle had weakened the old groove. Strike, and also tell the body where it is opening. The weak shove at the end of the blow did not look like much. The plate didn't split dramatically, but the Guardian's torso rotation broke rhythm for the first time. It felt it too. The faceless helm snapped toward me, and for one stupid instant, with death looking straight down a slit of black light at me, exhilaration cut clean through the fear. Not because I thought I was winning, because I could finally feel the language at speed. But, Horschel, dangerous. But there, Alden had said I was doing what the stones showed, ugly and real. Here, under the Guardian's arm, with my pulse trying to hammer up into my throat, I understood what he meant in my bones. The next action mattered because of the last one. Dorian's voice tore across the chamber. The same seam. I could have laughed if my lungs had not been occupied. The Guardian backhanded with its shield arm to pulp my chest. I met him on the run with his slanted guard, sliding the force away from center and let the slip carry my retreat not backward but around, opening the front of it to Brent. Brent did not hesitate. Iron Bastion lit him bronze and ugly and honest as he hit the construct in the chest with everything he had left. The Guardian absorbed most of it. Most was not all. Lydia's fire cut followed Brent's impact along the disturbed torso line I had marked. The seam split another inch. Black light leaked from within. The construct recoiled for the first time in something like instinct. Down, Merrick shouted. Not at us. At the Guardian. I saw why a second later. The split seam had exposed an inner branch channel running not only through the armor, but down into the old platform beneath it. For an instant, chamber and body were one vulnerable system. If the Guardian regained perfect posture, that line would close. If we broke the platform support under it while the link remained open, maybe. Owen understood before the thought finished. He became blue-white motion and carved across the exposed lower branch with 3 hits too fast to count separately. 2 failed. 1 bit. The Guardian's stance faltered. Mila's spirit weave, thin and strained as it was, looped across the cracking terrace seam and held just enough of the broken edges answer together that Brent could stay planted for 1 more second without the whole lower platform dropping under him. And me. This was the real turn. Not a single attack. A chain. I stepped in on the marked line. The thread on the Guardian's side let me feel its next torso twist starting before it completed. My first strike cut shallow at the lower seam, not for damage, but to reinforce the mark and force the weight to that leg. At the end of the cut, the aside shove rode into the stance and nudged the balance off-center. The Guardian answered with the shield arm, and I slipped that force off my rim instead of taking it, letting the redirection carry me into the stolen extra half step on the inner side. From there I drove my shield boss into the marked knee channel and felt the old groove buckle under the combined line of mark, destabilize, and impact. One flow, one action leading to the next through attached intent. Strike, mug, destabilize, impact. The Guardian dropped to one knee. The chamber shook with it. For a breath, everything widened. Lydia's eyes lit with the kind of cold joy only mages or killers know when the impossible finally presents a shape. Move. She did not need to say it twice. We all moved. Owen cleared left. Brent dragged Mila by the back of her coat out of the line. Merrick threw himself behind a pillar and took Dorian with him by the collar because the scholar would otherwise have died standing in revelation. I ran down the terrace and hit stone hard behind the central platform. Star-crowned sorcery descended in a focused vertical lattice from Lydia's hands and drove straight into the exposed branch channel running from the Guardian's split torso into the knee and down to the platform. This time the chamber could not shear it cleanly. The line was already open. The fire went in like judgment. The guardian convulsed once, not with pain I could understand, with the interruption. The old system inside it, whatever remained of old purpose beneath corruption, failed to reconcile the broken sequence. The black light in the helm slit flared wide, then fractured through subsidiary lines across its armor. The construct still did not die. Of course it didn't. It rose from one knee on half-ruined mechanics and lashed blindly with the bladed arm, taking a chunk out of the platform behind me large enough to kill if it had landed half a foot farther left. I rose badly, and nearly lost the room for one heartbeat under the wave of exertion and the sudden sharp brightness in my own head. Head pressure. Not a full collapse warning yet. Enough to remind me that my body was still human while the exhilaration tried to argue otherwise. Dangerous exhilaration. There it was. The feeling that I could keep going because the pattern was finally singing. The lie hidden inside that feeling being that singing things do not tear the instrument. I tasted iron in the back of my throat and kept moving anyway. The guardian had changed after the lattice strike. Worse in some ways, simpler in others. The corruption running through its channels now dominated where older branch logic had been more legible. Its actions came less cleanly layered and more brutally reduced toward kill, crush, hold. A damaged intelligence narrowing into single surviving purpose. That made it easier for the others to read. It also made it more vicious. Brent took a glancing shield slam that would have turned anyone else's rib cage into a different arrangement. He stayed up because Iron Bastion is obscene when it wants to be, and because stubborn men have a way of informing the body that collapse is a scheduling error to be corrected later. Owen's left thigh got opened by a back cut. He nearly escaped fully. Mila burned through the edge of her composure trying to keep spirit weave on the crumbling platform seams while also watching for old triggers. The fight was wicking in the walls. Lydia's hands shook once after the heavy lattice discharge, and only those of us close enough to matter noticed. Merrick stayed terrifyingly practical through it all. Right pillar hollow. Watch the terrace lip. Do not drive it onto the center crack. Cross if you're seeing the branch before the blow, call it. That last he shouted while parrying a glancing strike with a short miner's blade he had no right to make look that useful. So I called it. Not constantly. Only when the mark or the reed settled strongly enough to trust. High after the shield. Left sweep delayed. Not the torso foot. Owen obeyed the calls the fastest because speed and pragmatism make efficient partners when pride loses the argument. Lydia listened next, then Merrick. Brent pretended not to, but moved correctly often enough to expose the lie. Mila needed the least because by then she had found the rhythm of the chamber's old lines well enough to know when the guardian and the room were about to answer together. It became a terrible kind of music, not harmonious, dense, each of us adding one clear function and trying not to die before the others could land theirs. The guardian still had the edge in raw coherence. What changed was that for the first time we stopped feeding it isolated brilliance. We made it process accumulation instead. A speed cut that was also a distraction. A shield bash that was also a walling move. A spell line that was also area denial around a broken channel. A thread mark on a moving seam that was also the key to the next shout. Action, and something alongside. I do not mean we had mastered some ancient system in the course of one fight. We were barely holding on to fragments. But fragments can cut if enough of them point the same way. The construct made one final attempt to reassert control of the chamber by retreating if that word applied to the central platform recess where its body seemed most aligned to the old geometry. If it reached the exact center again, Lydia said later, we might have lost the line entirely. It almost did. The path that ran over a collapsed support rib across a cracked area no one had yet stepped on because the stone sounded wrong even before magic got involved. The guardian turned its damaged shield side inward, protecting the split torso seam, and used the bladed arm only to clear lanes, not kill immediately. Functional. Ruthless. Correct. We had seconds. Can you stop it there? Merrick shouted. Not alone, Lydia said. Then do not be alone. That was not a plan. It was enough. Owen went first, not to wound, but to force attention high on the shield's side. Brent came next on the opposite angle, too slow to surprise but heavy enough to demand accounting. The guardian took both lines and continued for the center anyway. It chose correctly by ordinary combat sense. That was why my entry mattered. I ran low from the cracked ring's edge with the breath held where it needed to be and the thread on the guardian's torso still faintly dragging at my awareness. Not enough now to feel every turn. Enough to know where the damaged line remained vulnerable under the shifted shield. I could not beat it by doing one thing better. So I stopped trying. My first movement was a feinting cut at the shield rim, not to land, but to make the guardian seal the obvious path. At the same moment, I let aside carry a thread mark off the blade contact into the shield edge itself. The instant it reacted to that line, I used the extra half step behind the committed motion to disappear from the expected distance and hit the cracked inner ring stone with my heel instead of the center line. That strike of my foot on old stone was deliberate too, real action, real consequence, and the minor shove riding it transferred into the unstable ring, not enough to break it, just enough to change the Guardian's next support point by a hair. It stepped. The cracked ring gave that hair, not collapse, till the Guardian's weight shifted toward the already split torso line. Now, I shouted. Lydia's fire needle hit the torso seam. Owen's blade bit the exposed rear knee. Brent smashed shield first into the damaged flank, and I drove my sword into the more fine torso. Hit it, and meant to benefit the core, but to say that every Bovington we had already tinned one final ugly consequence. The platform answered. Ancient stone does not roar. It gives. The inner ring under the Guardian's planted foot cracked wide. The damaged branch channels across its body flared black, then white, then nothing coherent at all. The old construct tried to recover with one last shield-led correction and discovered too late that its own next step no longer belonged to it. It fell forward into the center recess. The bladed arm hit stone and sheared off at the elbow. The helm struck next. Then the chamber let out a long dry groan like a throat remembering burial. No one moved for 2 full breaths. Then Merrick said, very evenly, if it rises again, I resign. It did not rise. The black corruption in the branch channels receded in thin smoking threads, not gone entirely, but no longer commanding the body. The old armored frame remained half-collapsed across the cracked center, one knee buried in broken ring stone, shield arm locked uselessly under its own weight. The silence afterward felt dangerous because fight silence always does. Lydia put one last careful astral point through the split helm slit. Nothing answered. Owen, breathing too hard and trying to hide it, nudged the severed bladed forelimb with his boot and got no motion. Brent sat down where he stood on the second terrace and looked like a man offended by his own pulse. Mila bent double with both hands on her knees, spirit weave gone completely from sight while she concentrated on not being sick. Dorian Pike stared at the fallen Guardian with the expression of someone whose mind had just opened 3 doors and found all of them active fire. My own body chose that moment to remind me what I had asked of it. The head pressure sharpened. My right hand trembled around the sword hilt. Breath came easier than it should have for the amount of effort spent, and that, more than the tremor, frightened me. The skill was smoothing function beyond what simple conditioning had earned. Useful. Dangerous. I let the sword tip drop and stood still until the room stopped trying to tilt under me. Dorian saw before anyone else. Zip. I'm fine. No, he said. You are post-breakthrough and lying badly. That phrase would have annoyed me if he had not been so correct. Merrick crossed the chamber and put a hand on one of the surviving pillars as if reacquainting himself with stone that was not currently murdering him. We need 5 minutes, he said. No one touches anything central without announcing it. That includes you, Lydia said. He glanced at her and, after a beat, nodded once. Fair. We took 8 minutes instead of 5 because the chamber demanded them. Mila found the old trigger lines the battle had disturbed and marked 2 sections of the upper terrace unsafe until settled. Brent wrapped Owen's thigh under Nina's absent imaginary supervision and grumbled the whole time because pain always sounded like argument in him. Lydia checked the Guardian's collapsed frame for a live magical response and found only old residue and one stubborn abyssal taint not refusing to die cleanly in the torso seam. Merrick walked the perimeter twice and confirmed there were no more active Guardians in the walls waiting for curiosity to outpace caution. Dorian finally approached the center, not alone. He made me and Lydia go with him because, in his words, one of you reads the old response badly enough to be honest about it and the other reads magical structure without trying to marry it. Lydia looked almost flattered by that until she realized it was not praise and only classification. The Guardian's fall had broken the central recess open wider than before. Beneath the collapsed body, the platform's center was not solid stone but a fitted panel arrangement around a shallow cavity. One side of the cavity had cracked under the impact. From the break protruded the edge of a flat object sealed in mineral crust and centuries of packed dust. Dorian crouched so quickly his knee struck broken stone. Do not breathe on it like cattle, he muttered, mostly to the universe. What is it? I asked. If I'm lucky, a record. If I'm unlucky, a partial record. He glanced up once, which means important. He used a narrow knife to clear only enough of the crust to free the object without snapping it. It was a tablet, not large. About the savannah of the hands, darted in the light of age. One hono cervical under the parade under the tilt wheel or seen water over the face put it over the tuts. The writing that emerged was not the modern script of Halcyon. Some of it wasn't writing at all. Part text, part diagram. Branch lines again descending from one central motion mark, each labeled in a tiny older hand. Along the upper edge ran a broken title band, or something like one. Dorian did not react the way treasure hunters in bad stories do. He did not smile. He looked sick. Lydia leaned in. You recognize it. In pieces. Read, Merrick called from the upper terrace. Dorian ignored the command for one heartbeat longer. eyes racing the cut lines, lips moving silently as he tracked correspondences between text and diagram. Then he said, "Not all. Too much is missing." "Enough," Lydia said. Dorian exhaled once, very carefully. The lower line here refers to know, not refers. Instructs. It's a sequence notation. He ran one finger just above the surface without touching. Primary act. Attached branches. Carry through. Preservation of subsequent line. Every word tightened the skin under my ribs. Lydia heard that too. And the heading. Dorian's face remained pale. The heading is broken. What survives? He swallowed once. Then, in a voice quieter than anything he had used all day, he read the surviving fragment. For the many-voiced marshal, no one in the chamber spoke. Even Brent stopped swearing at his own bandage. Dorian looked up from the tablet to me, then away, then back again, as if he disliked the angle from every direction equally. "The old turn here is damaged," he said. "But this root," his finger hovered over 3 surviving characters in the upper band. "It means something close to layered voices. Polyphony, not sound alone. Multiple lines carried together without collapse." The word hit harder than any of the chamber blows had. Not because it explained everything, because it explained enough. Many-voiced marshal, the rest broken away, but not broken far enough to miss the shape. Lydia's gaze sharpened into almost painful intensity. "That is not ritual language." "No," Dorian said. Merrick came down the terrace one step at a time and looked over the tablet with the expression of a man who has discovered the battle he has been fighting sits inside an older one with worse names. "Then what in God's, not God," Dorian said absently. "Training, doctrine, system, maybe school, maybe discipline, maybe warcraft. I need more text." I could not stop looking at the branching labels on the diagram. Primary act, attached branches, carry through, preservation of subsequent line. The tablet might as well have reached back through every humiliating scrap I had been left with since the summoning hall and rearranged the insults into a language older than the court that left. Not overpowered, not secretly glorious from the start. A fragment, an ugly surviving piece of something the current world no longer taught cleanly enough to recognize. Dorian saw whatever the expression on my face had become. He held the tablet tighter. "We leave," he said abruptly. Merrick blinked. "Now, yes, before this room drops, before the wardroom changes its mind, before any official with a seal learns enough to ruin the first question with the wrong answer." Dorian wrapped the tablet in cloth with movements almost too controlled. "We have enough." Lydia did not argue, which meant she agreed far more than she liked admitting. As we turned toward the ascent, I looked back once at the fallen guardian in the center recess, its old branch channels scorched and split, its singular purpose finally broken by too many small meanings converging in one place. Many-voiced marshal, the broken heading followed me up the terrace like a line of cold fire. And by the time we reached the first ramp back into the upper dark, I knew the question had already changed shape, because the old world had not lost this language by accident. And whatever it had once cost to learn, I had just paid only the first honest fraction.